So, welcome to this short Q&A with me, Sam Cuthbert. I'm a sports law barrister at House Temple Chambers, and I'm joined by David Seligman, who's a senior associate at Brandsmiths in their sports law team. He's got a brilliant football law practice in particular, and I've had the pleasure of working with David, so I'm very interested to hear what he's got to say today. We're going to have a 5 or 10 minute discussion about a story that many of you will have seen on the back pages in the last few days and weeks, and that's that Juventus have been banned from this season's Europa Conference League by Uefa and also fined for breaching the financial fair play rules. So, David, let's deal with the basics first. Financial fair play rules have been in the news quite a lot recently. Would you be able to give us a breakdown of those rules, how they operate and what they do?
So across confederations at UEFA or even at local sort of national level within the Premier League or Football League, and the same in various clubs of the Bundesliga and in France and Italy, each governing body as such has their own financial fair play regulations, and the idea is to limit the risk to clubs by spending beyond their means. I mean, there were stats, for example, in the Championship, there was one club that was spending 150% of turnover on player wages, which is obviously completely unsustainable and requires third-party funding to keep that club afloat. If third-party funding is withdrawn, then the club would go bust, a bit like my team to a point, Berry. So it's really quite an important mechanism to protect sort of the integrity of sport and really football clubs, which are, although owned by private individuals, a community asset. So UEFA, in the instance of Juventus, we're going to talk about, and the FIGC, which is the Italian Football Federation, have their own financial fair play rules, which Juventus fell foul of and have been punished accordingly. But those rules are really put in place not to sort of limit the competitive ability of Juventus, who are going to be able to compete against anyone, particularly domestically because of the size of the club, but really to protect the integrity of their competitions and the sustainability of each football club.
So the sanction against Juventus then comes in relation to the capital gains case that many of the listeners might have read about. And that's a case which concerned the club's directors, who were effectively altering the real value of their players in the transfer market, with a view to then stabilising their balance sheets. Would you be able to give us a sort of loose breakdown of the capital gains case? Because I think that would be quite helpful for viewers.
It's not unsurprising that clubs would take advantage of certain loopholes in order to gain an advantage, whether that be on the field or off the field in this instance. So what people don't tend to realise is if you sign a player for £100 million, for instance, and the player's in a 5-year contract, you can split the cost of that player over the period of 5 years. So when it comes to financial fair play and looking at profit and loss and sustainability for each particular season, you don't look at the glaring £100 million figure. You look at the fifth of that, so 20 million. But that doesn't necessarily apply when you sell a player. So if you were to sell a player for, say, 50 million, you would get that 50 million towards like essentially profit that you're getting, and you would offset that against not the loss of 100 million that you've contracted to spend, but basically a fifth of that, the 20 million. So from a sort of pure layman's terms, you're £30 million up when it comes to financial fair play. And that obviously goes into how much clubs turn over and whether that is sustainable and stuff, especially if, for example, you're getting a loss. So with Juventus, for instance, they were doing things like that, but they were being a little bit more creative than that. They had like youth players who they'd put in their books at valued at a certain amount of money that really wasn't quite justifiable when it was delved into. Or, for instance, there was a transaction involving Barcelona where actually both clubs were reprimanded, where essentially it was a player swap. And I think it was Juventus paid Barcelona essentially 12 million for Miralem Pjanic, and 12 million for Arthur. Miralem Pjanic went the other way. And what happened is, on paper though, it went down as a 72 million pound sale of Arthur and a 60 million sale of Pjanic, as opposed to a player swap deal plus 12 million, because then what each club could do is post on their sort of sustainability profit and loss figures for that particular accounting period as 60 million out the door and 72 million out the door, rather than an amount attributed to the value of the player, which is difficult to determine and might get scrutinised to a point. There might not be as much as 60 or 72 million. And in relation to Juventus, because they're paying more, 12 million coming off their sort of shit balance sheet. So if you look at like Juventus alone in that transaction, they sold a player for 60 million and bought a player for 12. So for that year, they're 48 million up. Really, they're not. They're 12 million pounds down, and they actually spent 12 million quid to get the player. So essentially, things like that and being quite creative drew attention of the FIGC, ultimately drew attention of UEFA, and Juventus were punished accordingly for that.
Interesting. And what we're really looking at there, I think, is effectively that the capital gains count directly towards a club's annual profits. And so if you inflate the value of an asset, then that may appear as though profits have been made on a given transfer.
Yeah, absolutely. And they're not the only ones who do this. There are a number of clubs that have been sanctioned, and there's a number of, and this is perfectly legitimately, but there's UEFA changed the rules recently, for instance, in relation to amortization. So you can't sign a player essentially on like an 8-year contract post 30th of June, which is why a certain number of deals were done by specific clubs pre 30th of June this year, because then you can split the transfer fee over a longer period of time if the player signs an 8-year contract, for instance. Player's happy because he's got 8-year contract, and also the club are content because they can, at that point, could amortise the transfer fee that paid out over an 8-year period, which obviously helped them comply with financial fair play.
Super interesting. So Juventus then received an initial 15-point deduction by the Italian Football Federation in January, and that was for financial irregularities and false accounting in relation to past transfer dealings. And to give you a kind of procedural history of really what happened, those points were then restored on appeal in April, pending a further new trial. Juventus then eventually had 10 points taken away, resulting in them dropping out of the top four and out of a place in the 23-24 Champions League. But their 7th place finish still entitled them to a Europa Conference League spot. Now, last Friday, the club announced in a statement that it had accepted a €20 million fine and a 1-year ban from competing in UEFA competitions for breach of the FFP regulations that you were talking about a moment ago, meaning that they won't play in the Conference League this year. Do you think that Juventus have thought longer term in the way that they've settled this case? And does this now remove the prospect, do you think, of further sanction in next year's Champions League too?
So Juventus have definitely decided to take like a damage limitation approach to this, because they released a statement saying that they don't agree with the decision to punish them as a whole. They don't think they've done anything wrong, but in the circumstances of basically being pragmatic and being commercial, they're going to accept the fine and accept a season without European football. Put it this way, it might be a little bit different if Juventus's points deduction was to an extent that they were having an amazing season, they were runaway leaders, and 10-point deduction or 15-point deduction didn't really matter, and they still finished 3rd and qualified for the Champions League. They might take a different approach, because actually a season out of the Champions League when you've qualified for it is very expensive. But given that they're not going to finish in the Champions League positions post deduction, and they'll be in the Europa Conference League, and financially, yes, there is a benefit to being in that, but that financial benefit isn't necessarily the be all and end all for a club like Juventus. I think from a sporting point of view, their fan base probably wouldn't really care too much if they won the Conference League. If anything, what you get qualified for the UEFA Cup if you win that, which is 2 great competitions, but not where Juventus want to be playing their football. So if you think about it, you pay a £20 million fine and you take a year without the Conference League. Whilst that might look like you're accepting defeat, if anything, you're not. You're playing a sensible game, because the alternative would be is you appeal the decision, you don't pay that fine, you play in the Conference League next year, you prolong the pain, you qualify for the Champions League again. But having said that, you delayed it. You qualify for the Champions League again. You delay the final decision. The ultimate decision might include a larger fine and might also create a longer ban from European competition. So maybe not 1 season, but 2 seasons. Now, if you missed out on 2 seasons of Champions League football, where it's guaranteed, that's far more expensive than £20 million in a fine. You might also get a bigger fine because you're pushing it on appeal. Generally, as a rule of thumb in litigation, in any sort of way of life, if you appeal the decision and ultimately shouldn't have appealed the decision, you get stung for that. So I think it's probably the sensible thing to do is take your medicine, pay the 20 million quid, don't play the Conference League next year, back in the Champions League. I mean, there's been a whole, as opposed to continuous sanctions and repeat offending, individual persons within Juventus have been sanctioned. So there was Tottenham sporting director who is banned and fined. You've got Pavel Nedved, legendary player, banned and fined. Andrea Agnelli, sort of bit legendary chairman of Juventus, he's had to step down. It's a completely new management team there. So you kind of think, and similar to Chelsea was sanctioned, the persons who are now controlling the club are different to the persons who incurred the liabilities of which have been punished. So I don't think they'll be sanctioned again going forward.
UEFA have also reached a settlement with Chelsea over the submission of incomplete financial information, and that related to historical transactions between 2012 and 2019, which is, of course, prior to the club's acquisition in 2022 by the Burley Clearlake Consortium. Now, that the club was obviously bought in May 22, and the new ownership has then undertaken to effectively identify and proactively report to UEFA any instances of incomplete financial reporting under the previous ownership. I'm interested, how much do you think that the new ownership is looking to distance itself from the now heavily sanctioned Abramovich and his tenure at the club? Albeit I should say, of course, that those sanctions are in the process of being challenged.
Look, it's with anything, with any football club that gets taken over, if ever there's a problem, it's very easy for the new owners to say, like, it was that guy, it wasn't us, that's not how we operate, we'll throw them under the bus, we're happy to do that, and going forward, we'll comply, we'll report towards you, and we'll do everything that we can do. I don't think it's necessarily distancing themselves from like any wrongdoing. Like Chelsea were super successful with regards to the Roman Abramovich era, and obviously it took the club from being a fashionable club but not a global leader, which it really is now. And arguably some people say the biggest club in London, but I don't agree with that. And so whilst they might distance themselves from these particular irregularities regarding financial reporting to UEFA, I think it's what any sort of club owner would do, whether it be at Chelsea or whether it be a team in League Two. Any new owner sort of would throw the previous owner under the bus with regard to historic sanctions, because that's just human nature, really.
Yeah. And I wonder if there's another element to it, which is effectively that there's a move from the Premier League against the government white paper proposals for a central regulator, which effectively, if clubs like Chelsea can show themselves to be properly self-policing, then they go some way to undermining the calls for central regulation in football, which will, of course, be costly and time-consuming for clubs if and when it is introduced.
A supporter of a football team that has suffered at the hands of incompetent regulators. I mean, the Football League at the period of time they made decision to kick Berry out under the then board was in circumstances where that board had directors on it from Derby County, who then spent a long period of time in administration, for instance. As someone who has suffered at the hands of a incompetent regulator at that point, it's probably surprising to hear that actually I think that the government introduction of a government regulator would be a bad thing for football generally. Actually, I think that genuinely would make things really difficult at the top level to produce a product which probably is the best in the world, the Premier League. So I really disagree with the introduction of government intervention within football. I disagree with sort of politics and sport generally. So yeah, I think whilst Chelsea might say essentially that they're complying with the regulator to demonstrate that there isn't a requirement for government intervention within football, I kind of agree with that. I think that's a really good salient point you raised.
One final question. How do you think Bury are going to get on this year?
Well, unfortunately, due to incompetent regulators, Bury's football season started last Saturday. So we're not starting in the EFL. We're a non-league team now. So we started last Saturday, won 5-1, played again Tuesday night, won 3-1. So I think we'll get promoted. Not the Shakers.
David, thank you very much for your time, and look forward to catching up again soon. Cheers.
Cheers, mate.